late October 1991. Mountain Studios, Montreux, Roger Taylor, arrived for what had become, by that point in Freddie Mercury's illness, an increasingly unpredictable kind of recording session. The band no longer working according to any fixed schedule, but instead responding to whatever brief windows of energy and clarity Freddie's condition allowed. Sometimes with only hours of advance, notice that a session might be possible. Roger has described, across the limited interviews where this specific afternoon has come up, a particular quality to Freddie's mood that day that differed from the sessions immediately preceding it, something he characterized as unusually reflective. Freddie apparently more inclined toward conversation and reminiscence than toward the focused technical work that had typically structured their remaining sessions together. They worked for a period on material that would eventually contribute to the finished Made in Heaven album, though Roger has, like Brian in his own separate accounts of similar sessions from this period, been notably reluctant to specify exactly which tracks emerged from this particular afternoon's work. What Roger has discussed in considerably more detail, across the small number of interviews where he has addressed this specific day at all, is a conversation that developed during a break in the recording. The two men sitting together in the studio's smaller lounge area while Freddie rested between takes. A conversation that began, according to Roger's account, with ordinary reminiscence about the earliest years of the band before drifting, gradually and without either man apparently steering it deliberately, toward considerably more difficult territory. Freddie had been discussing, according to Roger's recollection, memories from the band's earliest club performances in the years immediately following their 1970 formation. The specific texture of playing to audiences of a few dozen people in venues that bore no resemblance to the stadiums they would eventually fill, and Roger has described this portion of the conversation as genuinely light, both men laughing at shared memories of equipment failures and disastrous early gigs that had, across 2 decades of distance, transformed from embarrassing failures into cherished stories. The shift, when it came, arrived without warning, according to Roger's account, Freddie's tone changing mid-sentence in a way that Roger has struggled across every retelling to fully characterize beyond describing it as a specific quality of sudden seriousness that felt entirely different from the reflective warmth that had characterized the conversation up to that point. What Freddie said next, according to the version of this account that Roger has offered most consistently across the years, addressed not the band's shared history, but something considerably more personal and considerably more difficult, a specific worry Freddie had apparently been carrying privately that surfaced in this particular moment, without any obvious prompting from anything Roger himself had said. He said, according to Roger's most detailed public account of the exchange, offered in an interview conducted specifically about this period of the band's history, "I keep thinking about you three, standing on a stage without me, and I don't know if that thought makes me happy or if it breaks my heart completely. Both, probably. I want you to keep playing. I need you to keep playing. But every time I picture it, I picture the exact spot where I would have stood, and it's just empty, and I don't know how any of you are going to look at that empty spot every single night and not think of me standing there instead." Roger has said, across the interviews where he has discussed this specific sentence, that it was this particular image, the empty spot on stage where Freddie would have stood, described with such specific and vivid detail that broke through his own carefully maintained composure in a way that almost nothing else from that entire final period managed to accomplish. He has described sitting in that studio lounge, listening to Freddie articulate a fear that connected directly to Roger's own private and largely unexamined anxiety about what continuing to perform without Freddie might actually feel like, and finding himself, for what he has characterized as the only time across the entirety of Freddie's illness that he can specifically recall, unable to maintain the composed, practical demeanor that had otherwise characterized how he approached nearly every other difficult conversation during those final months. Roger has been explicit, across the different accounts he has given of this moment, that his tears in that specific instance were not simply grief in its general form. An emotion he has acknowledged experiencing frequently and often privately across Freddie's final year, but something more specifically triggered by the particular content of what Freddie had said. The recognition that Freddie was not simply expressing his own sadness about dying, but was, in that specific sentence, articulating a fear about what his absence would mean for the people who would continue without him. A fear that Roger has said he had never fully considered from Freddie's own perspective until hearing it described in exactly those terms. "I thought about missing him," Roger has said, according to the version of this quote that has circulated most consistently among people who have encountered this story. Obviously, everyone was thinking about that constantly by that point, but I hadn't thought about him worrying about us, about how we'd feel looking at an empty spot on a stage he wouldn't be standing on anymore. That specific image, hearing him describe it exactly like that, it got past whatever I'd built up to handle everything else. I don't know why that particular thing did it when so much else hadn't, but it did. Roger has said that his composure broke completely in that moment. Tears he has described as arriving without any warning or buildup, a specific and total loss of the controlled demeanor that had otherwise characterized his approach to nearly every other documented conversation from Freddie's final months. Freddie's response to Roger's tears, according to the account that has proven most consistent across the different interviews where this exchange has come up, involved a specific and immediate shift away from his own difficult admission toward comforting Roger instead, a pattern that appears, according to multiple separate accounts from different members of Freddie's inner circle, to have characterized much of his behavior across his final months, an apparently instinctive tendency to prioritize managing the emotional well-being of the people around him, even in moments when he himself had just voiced something profoundly difficult about his own experience of dying. Roger has described Freddie reaching for his hand, offering the kind of physical comfort that had characterized their friendship across more than 2 decades, and saying something that Roger has quoted with somewhat less precision than the original sentence that triggered his tears. Something to the effect of reassurance that the empty spot Freddie had just described so vividly would, in time, simply become part of the stage's new configuration. That audiences would learn to see Brian, Roger, and whoever eventually joined them as complete in themselves rather than as permanently marked by absence. A reassurance Roger has said he did not find entirely convincing in the moment, but that he has, across the subsequent decades of actually performing without Freddie, come to understand as containing more genuine wisdom than his own grief, allowed him to fully appreciate at the time it was originally offered. The specific circumstances under which this story eventually became public differ somewhat from similar accounts from other members of Freddie's inner circle, Roger having shared this particular exchange relatively earlier than some of the more guarded testimony that has emerged from other people close to Freddie during his final year. Offering a version of the account in an interview conducted within the first decade following Freddie's death, rather than waiting several additional decades before addressing it publicly at all. This relatively earlier disclosure has been characterized by people who have studied the broader pattern of testimony from Freddie's inner circle as somewhat unusual given Roger's generally reserved public persona regarding his own emotional experience of Freddie's death, a persona that has, in most other contexts, aligned him more closely with the extended private discretion that has characterized figures like Brian May's handling of certain private exchanges or John Deacon's near-total public silence. Roger has offered, when asked directly about this relatively earlier disclosure, an explanation that connects to his own specific understanding of what the story might offer to other people processing similar losses, suggesting, across the interviews where he has addressed this question, that he came to view the specific content of Freddie's worry, that the people left behind might struggle with the visible absence of someone they loved, as containing a broader universal truth about grief that extended well beyond his own specific circumstances as a famous musician continuing to perform on stages that Freddie had once shared with him. What makes this particular story distinct from other similarly structured accounts of private final year exchanges is the specific and unusually direct connection Roger has drawn between the conversation and his own subsequent professional life. A connection he has made explicit in ways that most other members of Freddie's inner circle have generally avoided when discussing comparably intimate testimony. Roger has said in more than one interview addressing Queen's continued live performances following Freddie's death that he thinks specifically about that October 1991 conversation during nearly every show, describing a private ritual of consciously acknowledging, internally and without any outward indication visible to the audience, the exact spot on whatever stage he happens to be performing on where Freddie would have stood, a practice he has connected directly and explicitly to the conversation's specific content. The empty spot Freddie had described with such vivid and troubling clarity during that October afternoon in Montreux. This ongoing practice, maintained by Roger's own account, across every subsequent performance in the more than 3 decades since Freddie's death, suggests that the conversation's emotional impact extended well beyond the single afternoon when it originally occurred, becoming instead a kind of permanent internal ritual that Roger has apparently carried into every subsequent professional context where the specific absence Freddie had worried about became immediately and unavoidably relevant. The broader significance of this story, beyond its specific value as one of the relatively few documented instances of Roger Taylor's composure visibly breaking in connection to Freddie's death, lies in what it suggests about the particular quality of emotional labor Freddie Mercury apparently continued performing for the people around him, even during his own most difficult final months. A pattern that appears across the accumulated testimony from multiple separate members of his inner circle, remarkably consistent, regardless of which specific person is offering the account. Freddie's worry in this particular exchange was not primarily about his own experience of dying, an experience that undoubtedly carried its own profound difficulty that he addressed. According to various accounts, through his own specific combination of practical focus and private processing, but about the ongoing emotional well-being of the specific people he understood would be left to continue without him. A worry articulated with enough vivid specificity, the exact empty spot on a stage, to break through even Roger Taylor's carefully maintained composure in a way that few other documented moments from this period apparently managed to accomplish. Roger Taylor has continued, across every documented Queen performance in the more than 3 decades since Freddie's death, according to his own repeated testimony, privately acknowledging that specific empty spot, carrying forward, through this small and entirely internal ritual, the exact conversation that broke his composure exactly once, on an October afternoon in 1991, in a recording studio lounge where 2 old friends had begun by laughing about disastrous early gigs and ended somewhere considerably more difficult and considerably more permanent than either of them had expected when the conversation first began.